The Johnson family was the kind of family people admired. Mark and Julia had been married for 17 years, building a life filled with love, laughter, and memories. Their only child, Ava, was the perfect daughter, smart, kind, and full of life. To anyone on the outside, they were a picture-perfect family. But inside the walls of their home, a secret had been buried for 16 years, hidden so deep that Julia had convinced herself it would never surface. Until now. It all started with a simple school project. Ava's biology teacher had assigned the class a DNA ancestry project, a fun way for students to explore their roots and understand genetics. Excited, Ava rushed home that evening, tossing her backpack on the couch as she waved the test kit in front of her parents. "Mom, Dad, look, we're doing this DNA thing at school. It's so cool. I can trace my ancestry and see where we come from." Mark chuckled, ruffling her hair. "That sounds fun. Maybe we'll find out we're royalty." Ava laughed. "Yeah, maybe I'm a lost princess." But Julia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. For a split second, her face froze, her fingers tightening around the glass of water she was holding. But she recovered quickly, forcing a small laugh. "That's interesting, sweetheart," she said carefully. "But do you really need to do it? I mean, we already know our family history." Ava frowned. "Well, yeah, but this test goes deeper. It shows genetic matches and stuff. It's part of our grade, so I have to." Julia swallowed. She felt a strange tightness in her chest, a whisper of fear that she hadn't felt in years. "Then I guess you should do it," she said softly. That night, as Ava eagerly swabbed her cheek and sealed the test kit, Julia watched from the doorway. Her hands were trembling. She had spent 16 years protecting this secret, locking it away in a part of her heart she never dared to open. She had never imagined a simple school project could shatter everything. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Ava was impatient, constantly checking her email for updates on her results. Mark, completely unaware of his wife's distress, teased her about what they might find. "Maybe we'll discover you have Viking blood," he joked one evening. "Or maybe some ancient warrior ancestors." Ava grinned. "Or maybe I'm part Italian. That would be cool." Julia, on the other hand, felt like she was suffocating. Every night when the house was silent, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself she was overreacting. The test wouldn't change anything. It couldn't, but deep down a small voice whispered, "What if it does?" Then, one evening, it happened. Ava was in her room when a notification popped up on her phone. "Your DNA results are ready." Her heart leaped with excitement. She grabbed her laptop, rushing to open the report. Mark was watching TV when he heard her scream. "Ava," he called, standing up. "What's wrong?" Julia, who had been in the kitchen, froze mid-step. Ava came running down the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. "Dad," she whispered, Why isn't your name here?" Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Ava held up her laptop, pointing at the results. "It shows my genetic matches. But you're not on here. You're my dad. You should be the closest match." A heavy silence filled the room. Mark took the laptop from her hands, his eyes scanning the screen. His expression changed instantly. This has to be wrong," he muttered. He turned to Julia. "Honey, did you ever take a DNA test?" Julia's face had lost all color. Her fingers clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Julia?" Mark's voice was sharper now. "Did you ever take a test?" She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. Her entire world was crumbling around her. Mark turned back to Ava. "It's probably a mix-up, sweetheart. Maybe the system didn't register me for some reason." But Ava shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No, Dad. This says you're not my biological father." Mark's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the report, searching for an explanation. But there wasn't one. The truth was staring at him in cold, unforgiving letters. He wasn't Ava's father. He had never been Ava's father. Ava turned to her mother, her voice breaking. "Mom, what's going on?" Julia couldn't look at them. She couldn't breathe. This was it. The secret she had buried for 16 years had just come to light. And now there was no way to escape it. Silence. It stretched across the room, suffocating, thick with something far worse than anger, betrayal. Mark stood frozen, gripping the laptop so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes were glued to the words on the screen, but his mind refused to process them. This had to be a mistake. It had to be. Ava. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Are you sure? Ava's hands trembled as she nodded, her face pale. Dad, the test says my closest genetic match is Mom. But you're not there. You're supposed to be my other half. Her voice cracked, her breathing uneven. How is that possible? Mark turned sharply to Julia. His wife, his partner, the woman he had trusted with his heart. She hadn't moved. She stood by the kitchen counter, her hands gripping the cold marble surface as if it was the only thing holding her upright. Her head was bowed, her long dark hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. Mark's stomach twisted. She knew. She had known all along. Something hot and ugly burned in his chest as realization crashed down on him. Julia, his voice was dangerously low, trembling with restrained fury. Say something. She lifted her head, her lips parting, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed like she was drowning, desperate for air, for an escape. Mom? Ava's voice was small, fragile. Please tell me this is a mistake. Julia swallowed hard. The weight of her daughter's pleading eyes, the devastation in Mark's face. It was too much. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her lips trembled. And finally she whispered, I'm so sorry. Ava took a step back. What? Mark slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Sorry? His voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. That's all you have to say? Julia's shoulders shook, but she couldn't find the words to fix this. Mark's pulse was thundering in his ears. Tell me right now, Julia, who is Ava's real father? Julia pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, muffling a sob. Mark, please. Mark's eyes darkened. You're telling me that for 16 years, you let me raise a child thinking she was mine? You let me love her, protect her, give her everything while hiding this from me? Julia gasped, stepping toward him. No, Mark, she is yours. You raised her. You are her father. Biologically, I am nothing to her, Mark cut her off. His voice was cold, ice cold. So tell me, Julia, who is? Ava was crying now, her whole body trembling. Mom, please, just tell us the truth. Julia clutched her chest. She could feel her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, suffocating her, crushing her under the weight of the moment she had been dreading for 16 years. Mark took another step toward her. His voice dropped lower, filled with something deadly and dangerous. Who is her father? Julia squeezed her eyes shut. Her throat burned. How had it come to this? She had spent years convincing herself that the past was buried, that Mark would never have to know, that Ava would never find out. But she had been so wrong. Ava's DNA results had ripped the truth out of the grave she had buried it in. And now there was no escaping it. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet Mark's piercing gaze. And then she whispered the words she never thought she'd have to say. Ava's father is someone from my past. Ava staggered back like she had been slapped. Mark let out a bitter, humorless laugh. A cruel sound. Someone from your past? His hands clenched into fists. That's all you're going to say? Julia's chest rose and fell rapidly. Mark, I never wanted you to find out like this. Find out what? He roared. That my entire life has been a lie? Julia sobbed. No, Mark, please. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were unreadable. Another DNA test, he said suddenly. His voice was flat, emotionless. Julia's heart stopped. What? Mark's jaw was tight. We're going to a real lab, not some school project test. Ava wiped her tear-streaked face. Dad? Mark turned to her, softening just for a second. I need to be sure, sweetheart. I won't believe this until we get real proof. Ava nodded slowly. Okay. But Julia's breath came out in short, panicked gasps. Mark, please, we don't need to. Mark shot her a look that silenced her instantly. We do. And that was the end of the conversation. The next morning, they drove to the city's top genetic testing lab. The car ride was silent. No one spoke. No one even looked at each other. Ava felt nauseous. Mark felt empty. And Julia? She felt like a prisoner being marched to her execution. At the lab, Mark and Ava took their DNA tests. The technician assured them the results would be ready in 3 days. 3 days. 72 hours of torture. Mark barely spoke to Julia when they got home. He didn't touch her, didn't look at her, didn't even sleep in the same bed. Ava locked herself in her room, unable to face her mother. And Julia Julia sat alone in the darkness, staring at the wall. She had thought she had more time. She had thought she could keep her secret forever. But now her time was up. And in just 3 days, the truth would be exposed for the world to see. 3 days later, Ava was the first to check her email. Her hands shook as she clicked on the new message. Her heartbeat roared in her ears as her eyes scanned the report. And then she dropped her phone. Her legs gave out beneath her. She couldn't breathe. Her father wasn't her father. Mark Johnson was not her biological dad. The DNA test had confirmed it. Mark took one look at the results, and then without a word he turned to Julia. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. Who is her real father? Julia's entire body shook, and that was when she knew she couldn't hide it anymore. Julia's world collapsed in slow motion. Mark stood before her, his face carved from stone, his eyes dark, unreadable. Ava sat on the couch, her hands trembling, her face pale, eyes red from crying. The room felt too small, too suffocating. The truth was out. Mark Johnson was not Ava's father. Julia's secret, the one she had spent 16 years burying, had risen from the dead. And now, Mark's next words sent a chill through her spine. Who is Ava's real father? Julia's breath hitched. She had known this moment would come. She had dreaded it. But now that it was here, she couldn't find her voice. Mark took a slow step forward. Say it, Julia. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with something dangerous. Ava wiped her tears, her voice shaking. Mom, please, tell me who he is. Julia clutched her chest. Her heart pounded so violently it hurt. Mark's stare bore into her. If you don't tell me, Julia, I will find out myself. She knew he meant it. Mark was the kind of man who didn't stop until he had the truth. And if she didn't tell him now, he would dig and dig until he uncovered everything. Her lips trembled, and finally she whispered his name. Daniel. Silence. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mark's eyes narrowed. Ava's lips parted in shock. Then Mark took another step forward, his voice dropping into something dark and dangerous. Daniel? His jaw clenched. As in Daniel Carter? Julia felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Ava's head snapped toward her mother. Wait, Daniel Carter? The billionaire? Mark's hands curled into fists. His voice was sharp. You mean to tell me that my daughter's real father is one of the richest, most powerful men in this country? Julia's throat burned. There was no turning back now. She nodded. Ava gasped, covering her mouth. Tears filled her eyes again. Mark let out a cold, bitter laugh. Unbelievable. He shook his head. You had a child with that man, and you let me believe she was mine? Julia's lips trembled. Mark, I never wanted to hurt you. Never wanted to hurt me? Mark's voice rose, his anger boiling over. Are you hearing yourself, Julia? His hands trembled with rage. You stole my right to know the truth. You let me love a child who was never mine. You lied every single day for 16 years. Julia flinched. I was scared. Scared of what? Mark roared. That I'd leave you? That I'd walk away? He took a deep breath, running a hand down his face. His voice cracked. Did I mean that little to you? Julia's eyes filled with tears. No, Mark, I love you. Mark laughed bitterly. Love? You don't lie to people you love, Julia. Ava watched in horror as her parents' marriage crumbled before her eyes. Her voice was small, broken. Mom, how did this happen? Julia sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Memories crashed over her like waves. 17 years ago. She had been young, naive, and deeply in love, or so she thought. Daniel Carter had swept her off her feet. A man so powerful, so charming that she had fallen hard and fast. But she had been nothing more than a secret to him. When she found out she was pregnant, everything changed. Daniel didn't want the baby, didn't want her. Get rid of it, Julia. This wasn't part of the plan. His cold words had shattered her. She had begged, pleaded. But Daniel was a man who only cared about himself. So she left. She walked away from his wealth, his power, his world. And then she met Mark, a man with a heart so kind, so full of love that he made her believe in happiness again. She never told him about Daniel, never told him the baby she carried wasn't his. She convinced herself that if she buried the truth, it would never come back. But now, here they were. Mark's voice snapped her back to the present, cold, sharp, final. So all these years you let me live a lie, while the real father, the billionaire, is out there, not knowing he has a daughter? Julia nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. Ava's breath came out in short, panicked gasps. Mom, does he even know I exist? Julia hesitated. Then she shook her head. Ava's stomach dropped. Mark let out a sharp breath. That's it! I'm done! Julia's head snapped up. Panic flashed in her eyes. Mark, don't! He raised a hand, stopping her. Don't say another word. He turned away, grabbing his keys. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched. Where are you going? Julia's voice was filled with fear. Mark didn't look back. To find Daniel Carter. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs. Dad, wait, but the front door slammed shut. Ava and Julia sat there, frozen. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on them like a crushing storm. Mark was on his way to find Daniel Carter. The truth, the one Julia had hidden for 16 years, was about to explode, and nothing would ever be the same again. Mark's car roared down the highway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing. His heart was burning. 16 years. 16 years he had loved Ava as his own. 16 years he had believed a lie from the woman he had trusted with his life. Now there was only one thing left to do. Find Daniel Carter, the billionaire, the man who had abandoned Julia, the real father of the girl Mark had raised as his own. Mark had never met Daniel in person, but he knew exactly where to find him. The whole world knew where to find him. Carter Enterprises, one of the most powerful corporations in the country. Mark pulled up in front of the glass skyscraper, his heart pounding like a war drum. He stepped out of his car, his entire body humming with tension. Security guards at the entrance tensed as he approached. Sir, do you have an appointment? One of them asked. Mark's jaw clenched. Tell Daniel Carter that Mark Johnson needs to see him, now. The guard exchanged looks with his partner. Mr. Carter doesn't take unannounced meetings. Mark took a step closer, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. Then tell him it's about his daughter. Silence. The guard's face shifted. He lifted his radio, murmured something into it, then nodded. Follow me. Mark exhaled sharply. This was it. Back at home, Julia was pacing the living room, her hands trembling. Ava sat on the couch, her face pale, her breath coming in shaky bursts. He's really doing it, Ava whispered. He's really going to tell him. Julia ran a hand through her hair. This was her worst nightmare coming true. If Daniel knew about Ava, he wouldn't just walk away. He was too powerful, too proud, too controlling. And if he decided he wanted Ava in his life, nothing would stop him. Julia felt sick. Ava looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, what if he wants me? Julia's heart shattered. Mark was led into a massive office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, and there, standing behind a sleek black desk, was Daniel Carter. Tall, cold, ruthless. Dressed in a custom suit, he looked like a man who ruled the world. His eyes flicked up, sharp and calculating. Who the hell are you? Mark steeled himself. My name is Mark Johnson. He took a step closer, his jaw tightening. And I've been raising your daughter for 16 years. Daniel's expression didn't change. A slow, almost amused smirk pulled at his lips. I don't have a daughter. Mark's blood boiled. Her name is Ava, he bit out. She's 16 and she's yours. Daniel's smirk vanished. For a moment, he just stared. Then, in the blink of an eye, he moved. Mark barely had time to react before Daniel was in front of him, his expression lethal. Where's Julia? His voice was low, dangerous. Mark stood his ground. At home, with our daughter. Daniel's fists clenched, his jaw ticked. For the first time, Mark saw something flash in his eyes, something that looked like rage. Mark wasn't sure if it was because Julia had kept the secret from him, or because he had lost control of something that had been his. Daniel turned to his assistant. Get my car ready. Now. Mark's chest tightened. Daniel was coming for Ava. Julia's heart stopped when she heard the knock on the door. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Daniel Carter had arrived. Ava's breath hitched. Mark stood next to them, his expression unreadable. Slowly, Julia moved to the door. Her hands trembled as she turned the handle. And then there he was, the man who had broken her, the man she had spent 16 years trying to forget. Daniel Carter. His eyes met hers, and for a second, just a second, something flickered in them. Then his gaze moved past her, to Ava, his daughter. Ava froze. She had seen Daniel Carter before, on TV and magazines, on the news, but seeing him in real life, knowing he was her father, it was too much. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. Ava. The way he said her name made her shiver. Julia moved fast, stepping between them. No, she whispered. Daniel, please. He ignored her. His cold, powerful gaze stayed on Ava. You should have been mine, he murmured. You were supposed to grow up in my world, not here. Ava shrank back. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. She's not some possession for you to claim, Carter, Mark said, his voice dark. She has a life, a family. She's not some pawn in your empire. Daniel turned to him. His smirk was pure arrogance. And who are you? Mark's eyes burned. I'm the man who raised her, the man who loved her, something you were too much of a coward to do. Daniel's jaw tightened. For the first time, his mask cracked. Ava's voice suddenly cut through the tension. I don't want to go with you. Daniel froze. Ava's hands were shaking, but her voice was strong. I don't know you. You're just a stranger. My real father is the man who raised me. Daniel's nostrils flared. You don't know what you're saying. Ava stood her ground. I know exactly what I'm saying. I don't belong to you. Julia felt her chest tighten with emotion. Daniel took a step back. For the first time in his life, he had lost. Mark's hand found Ava's shoulder, steady and strong. Daniel's gaze flickered to Julia one last time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Julia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Mark pulled her close. It's over, he whispered. Ava let out a shaky breath. She turned to Mark. Dad? Mark's eyes softened. And in that moment, he knew. Blood didn't matter. DNA didn't matter. Ava was his daughter. And nothing would ever change that. As Daniel Carter's car disappeared into the night, Julia, Mark, and Ava held on to each other. Their family wasn't broken. It was stronger than ever.